Well, thank you, Betsy. And Amy is going to share a screen with us. Uh, and let me say that it is good to be back. And I wish that I was in Underwood, and I wish that I was staying right now in Pelican. But here we are, and more of us can join us because we're doing this virtually. You know, I've been coming and sharing with you for over a decade. And as Betsy mentioned, it was my dear friend Marguerite, who's here, who first brought me and continued to bring me along. So many of you, or at least I think some of you, probably have thought from time to time, well, that's all fine and good about what's happening in South Sudan and what's happening in Iraq and what's happening in Mindanao. But how does this relate? And so today I'm going to talk about how peacekeeping has come home to the United States. And it's really a time to think about, are we afraid of the world unraveling, or are we ready to rethink the way that we hold it together? We are not going back anywhere. We are moving forward. What the future looks like is really open. Are we open to a new story? Are the jagged and brutal contradictions of a climate crisis, a global pandemic, structural racism that has been splayed across the internet, and a division of wealth that has a few people in the stock market celebrating while the majority of the world suffers? Are there enough contradictions to us to say that's an old story? Now we're ready to create a new story. As Seamus Haney said, a story that's on the far side of revenge, a place where hope and history rhyme. And we are at that moment today. Next. So we will create this story. By every breath that we take, we can bring change and bring about that beloved community that you have created in Underwood and that Martin Luther King and so many talked about. Next. So part of that story is that we can meet violence, not with more violence, that just creates more violence. We can meet violence with nonviolence. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we look like in various parts of the world in terms of unarmed civilian protection. We are nonviolent, we are nonpartisan, and we always rely on the primacy of local people to set the agenda. We have specially trained professionals who work full-time on security and peacekeeping. Our teams now come from 35 different countries, and as Anne Frisch introduced herself, she was a peacekeeper in Guatemala. We also have Asha Ashokan from India today, who was a peacekeeper in South Sudan and now is in Minneapolis, looking at how to apply the lessons that we've learned in other places to our hometown. 50% of our team are women, and that is not to fulfill some politically correct quota. It is because we need women as well as men, as well as transgender people to bring about a holistic form to peacekeeping. We're strategic, we're nimble, we live in the communities we serve, and we're cost effective. It costs us much less to field unarmed civilian protectors than it does armed peacekeepers or even police. So in this equation, we're the fiscal conservatives. Next. I put this on just to give you an idea. This was actually a job advert that we had on our website recently, that the job is physically demanding, that we live in remote settings in either tents or cement buildings with no electricity or running water. And sometimes we are required to walk through rough terrain, as you see Hybrid doing right there, for 6 to 8 hours a day. And we have yet to have a problem finding recruits. We always have more people applying than we can hire. Next, please. So this is just to give you, it doesn't show up very well, but to give you an idea that there are a variety of methods that we've seen have worked and are effective in areas of violent conflict. And not every one of these methods works everywhere. And so if you'll go to different places, you will see a different combination of these methods being used. And I'll give you some illustrations of those if we can proceed, Amy. Protective accompaniment is one of the most often used methods. Here you see Tiago, a fellow from Brazil who's been with us. He was first with Anne in Guatemala over a decade ago, and he's now in South Sudan. Accompanying women from what are called protection of civilian sites that sprung up after a brutal war reemerged at the end of 2013. Women have to leave these areas every day for a variety of reasons, including to collect firewood. They have been routinely raped, both by government soldiers as well as rebels. Rape is weaponized, is an instrument of war. And we found over a 4-year period that if people like Tiago and others accompany these women, the armed men leave them alone. This was 100% successful over a 4-year period. I am now, with measured happiness, willing to say that, or happy to say in a measured way, that there is a peace agreement and that at least these rapes have decreased. Next, please. Protective presence is another method that we use where people who are well-trained stay in places that are under threat. Here you see Andreas and Derek, who were in a camp in South Sudan when it was breached by rebel soldiers who started shooting people point blank in the head. Derek and Andreas took 14 women and children whom they were with to a hut and stood in the doorway. On 3 occasions, the young rebels, younger than these guys, came with brand new AK-47s. And a pop quiz, how many AK-47s are manufactured in South Sudan? Now, if you said 0, you're right. There are lots of people in the global north who get rich off of these wars and have a stake in them continuing. So these rebels pointed their guns at Andreas and Derek's head 3 different times and said, you've got to go, in rather profane language, get out of here, you're not supposed to be here. And on 3 occasions, Derek and Andreas held up their nonviolent peace force identity cards and said, we are here to protect civilians, we are unarmed, and we will not leave. After the 3rd time, the young rebels left. And Derek and Andreas could hear them saying to their colleagues, don't go back up there, don't go there, leave those guys alone. Next. This is a IDP camp that actually was mentioned on the opinion page of the Star Tribune this morning as a fetid place. This is a place in northern Iraq where the families and the widows of the ISIS fighters are living, and they are despised by everyone. They were being attacked at night, and we find that if our people simply walk the lanes at night, that the people are safe, that these women and children will not be attacked. That's simply by our people being present and visible and walking the lanes. Next. We also help to open up humanitarian access. This is back in South Sudan, where one of the rebel groups notified us that there were villages in the territories that they controlled that had not been, that did not have medical care, did not have adequate food, but no humanitarians were going there. They thought that if we had went and led the way, that the humanitarian groups would follow. So here you see Cecile and Catherine discussing what to do. We did have to winch out, winch out 3 different times. I was on the 3rd trip in, and indeed, we went to 2 villages where people did not even have soap. But by the 3rd time, the Norwegian Refugee Committee was with us, then UNICEF followed, Oxfam, and other humanitarian groups. This demonstrates why it's so important that we're nonpartisan, that we can communicate with government armed actors, but we can also communicate with rebels. Next. Early warning, early response. This is the last story. I've got lots of stories to tell. These stories contribute to that news story. This is on the island of Mindanao in southern Philippines, where there's been an ongoing conflict between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the armed forces of the Philippines. In this case, patrols from each group were converging on the village, and people started to pack up, they started to panic. They had worked with our team on early warnings, so they contacted our team, and there you see our team in the village. En route to the village, the team called both the Moro Islamic Liberation Front local commander and the armed forces of the Philippines and said, there must be a mistake. Your guys are about to put this village in a crossfire. We know you don't want that to happen. And further, we know that you know it's a violation of the ceasefire. By the time our team got there, people were celebrating because the armed groups had backed off and people stayed home. Next. So, protective presence. It also is being done here in the United States and can be expanded upon. Here you see the Michigan Poor People's Campaign. And you know that there's a lot of armed militia groups active in Michigan, being protected by a presence of the Meta Peace teams. Next. And here we can see in demonstrations, members of peace teams accompanying demonstrators and providing that buffer between the demonstrators and police. Next, please. And in Minnesota, I'm sure many of you remember in the late 80s when the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe started to exercise their treaty rights that they had had for over a century to spearfish in Lake Mille Lacs. And soon white fishermen and women started to show up and harass. And as you can see by the sign, threaten violence. And a group of the band came to the Twin Cities at that time and talked to us and said, we think if you're there between us, we'll be safe. And indeed, groups came from around Minnesota and provided that interpositioning, and the Native people could go about living their treaty rights. Next. Here is a scene in St. Paul during the Republican National Convention, where hundreds of police officers, not only from St. Paul, but came in from the region. As one police chief, Tony Boza, said, it was an orgy of overtime. But you can see that they were ready for fights. And again, well-trained people interpositioning themselves could decrease the violence that went on. Next, please, Amy. And in Baton Rouge a few years ago, where this woman, a nurse from New York, who had never been to a demonstration, stepped in front of police and kept them from attacking demonstrators. Next, please. So imagine Imagine what if a team that was trained had done interpositioning in Kenosha last summer. Perhaps several people would still be alive. Next. Or what if a team that was well trained in de-escalation and rumor control was in Minneapolis and could go back and forth among the parties, sharing information and de-escalating that conflict. Next. So wherever we are, we work with communities on what's called early warning and early response. And we help communities to define those indicators that trouble is brewing. And if you look at where we are right now and the indicators, we are on the verge of deep violence, the extreme polarization, the us versus them, the hate speech, no social consensus on facts, what we're even talking about, an increase in police brutality, increased domestic terrorism, unequal access to basic goods and services, open violence that starts to mix with politics, and no commitment to a peaceful transfer of power. Hopefully that is changing right now. Next. And we have to be aware that there are alt-right nationalists and white supremacist groups that are active in Minnesota. Marguerite, in her history, it's all documented in the Pelican Library, identified the activity of the Ku Klux Klan in Otter Tail County, right there in Pelican Rapids and north of Pelican. Well, they have lived on and they are here and they are amongst us, as are white supremacist groups. There have been, since the murder of George Floyd, over 150 examples of harassment of primarily Black groups at demonstrations by these supremacist groups. One of the things to be careful of is if you see the number 1488, that is a symbol of white supremacy. The 14 words saying that we have to make our country safe for our white children, and 88, meaning 8 is the 8th letter of the alphabet, or H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. 88 stands for Heil Hitler. And these groups are there. We've seen them in the Twin Cities, and they're also in Otter Tail County. Next, please. So we have peace building. We can all engage in this new story. There are little things and big things that we can do, and the little things matter. We can urge patience among us as there is this transfer of power. We can stop rumors. Rumors kill people and rumors circulate so fast. We can simply be kind to one another. We can reach across those lines that have been cleaved in our communities and at the same time denounce hate groups and speak up every time there's an example of hate speech. We can work to be actively racist, as we see now that the Minnesota Council of Churches is putting together a very proactive Truth and Reparations Commission for the state. Simply, we can make an improbable friendship. We have to do this over Zoom right now, but reach out to people who in some way or another have been defined as the other. And I know that this is a hard one, but we have to continue to work to ban rapid fire weapons. Next. So in Minneapolis, among the things we're doing, the week after the murder of George Floyd, the Minneapolis School District voted to not renew their contract with the Minneapolis police. Instead, security specialists were hired, and we were hired to provide them with training on unarmed approaches and de-escalation methods to work with threats in schools, but also to see students as the center of security, not the center of the problem. Next, please. We've been working with training other groups in terms of unarmed civilian protectors. Here you see young men who are from a gang diversion program in North Minneapolis, who on election day, when we worked with unions and religious groups and community groups to provide poll protectors at 30 vulnerable polling places in Minneapolis and St. Paul, these young men provided protection at the 2 polling places at North High School. And despite all of the news in advance about groups being recruited of veterans of special forces who were to be paid $910 a day to come to Minnesota, despite the Trump campaign trying to recruit off-duty and retired police from the Police Federation of Minneapolis, the same federation that defends the murderers of George Floyd. That with all of this going on, there were very, very few incidents of intimidation and really none of violence at those 30 polling places. Next. And so as we learn how can these methods that have worked in South Sudan, in Iraq, in Guatemala, and Sri Lanka, how can they apply in Minneapolis? We are now finding that there are lots of ways in terms of accompaniment, interpositioning, proactive presence, methods that can be effective. And so part of what we're doing is to defend or to organize and train a group of volunteer peacekeepers who will be ready to work and do violence prevention on the streets of Minneapolis starting in March in advance of the trials of the former police officers. Next. So, and Brother David, who knew Martin Luther King, who's with us today, who met Martin Luther King when David was 15. He told us, we still have a choice today. And this was, he said in 1968, we still have that choice today of nonviolence or coexistence. Nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. The window is closing, but we still have that chance. Next. We are co-creators, whether we recognize it or not. And as part of that new story, we can transform from a thing-oriented civilization to a sentient being-oriented civilization, from a story of separation to a story of independence. Next. And remember, there are more peace builders, conflict transformers, mediators, nonviolent resistors, unarmed civilian protectors alive today than ever before, and that number grows every day. And that is not insignificant. Next. Keep in mind, keep in your heart that everything that is needed to build a culture of peace and nonviolence already exists in each of us. It is here, it is now, and we have everything we need. Next. Thank you.